Okay. Hey guys, what's up? Thank you so much for being here. Today, I have a really special guest. He is the founder of this company called Microbiome Labs, and he created an amazing product that has really helped me recently with some digestive issues that I was dealing with, even though I was eating a 100% raw vegan diet for the last 11 years. Okay, so like a really perfect diet, in my opinion, I still had some health issues. And so this product really helped me. And I'm really excited to talk to him. So please help me welcome Kiran to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I got a lot of questions for you. So I want to dive into them real quick. First of all, what makes this product different than any other probiotic on the market?
Yeah, to start, one of the things that's really important to us is understanding how our products work, right? And what they do in your system. So research has to tell the story. So we invest a lot in clinical research on the MegaSpore product itself. We have, I think, 11 published studies. So it really gives us an understanding of what the product's doing in the gut. And then that actually helps us understand how better to utilize the product in order to impact people's lives. But going back to the origin of the product itself, what was the impetus for creating it? Where did it come from? And what was the idea around it? It was the first all spore consortium product. So we use Bacillus endospores, which are different types of probiotic strains than what most people are commonly familiar with. Most people are familiar with things like lactobacillus and bifidobacteria, which are commensal organisms, but they are not naturally found in the environment, right? So we lean more towards what are naturally found in the environment as organisms. And what we also realize is that the vast majority of organisms found in the natural environment aren't actually functioning probiotics. Most of them will die in the stomach as you consume them, just like a lot of conventional probiotics die in the stomach when you consume them. And so we honed in on a species that, or a genus that really was able to survive through the harsh gastric environment and then function in the GI tract, with the whole idea that we naturally would gain exposure to these organisms if we ate and lived similar to our ancestors, right? If we ate off the land, ate dirt, drank water from rivers and streams, what kind of microbes would we get exposed to, and which of those microbes would actually survive through and act as probiotics? So that's how we honed in on these unique spore-forming bacteria that not only survive through the gastric system, make their way to the intestines alive, but then when they get there, they actually function as probiotics, meaning they're doing something that conveys a health benefit to the host. And then that something, whatever that something is, that's what we have to figure out through research, right? So that's why, hence all of the investment in the research that we've done as well.
Amazing, amazing. And so what is the source of the bacteria? Like where do you find this bacteria?
Yeah, so naturally, this is a GI commensal strain. So initially, the strains were identified in the microbiomes of healthy individuals. But that's not where you extract them from and for each batch of product, right? So what we do is we grow them through fermentation. So we have the original seed strains that we keep in these vials, these frozen vials, in our strain library. And then every time we want to make a new batch, we bring out some of that strain and we grow it in a fermentation process. And then we extract them from that fermentation media, and that's what you see that ends up in the bottle.
Wow, that is so interesting. Okay, so what inspired you to create this product specifically?
Yeah, so I had a research company before starting Microbiome Labs, where I would design and conduct clinical trials for other companies. I'd also work with product development for other companies, kind of trying to bring science to the product development side of dietary supplements. I had a project with a large multinational company that had asked us to look at probiotics in the marketplace and help them figure out what are the right probiotics. So are we the refrigerated ones? Is it 50 billion? Is it 100 billion? What's the right dose? And basically through our investigation, we came to learn that most of that is kind of nonsense. It's a lot of marketing nonsense. The refrigerated versus non-refrigerated, the 50 billion versus 25 billion. A lot of that was just kind of made up stuff that didn't actually have any scientific validity to it. And when we came up with this findings, we went to the company and said, hey, this is what we're finding. We think probiotic technologies are really underutilized because most companies are just kind of following some weird marketing pattern of more strains, more CFUs, and so on, without really looking at the quality of the strain, right? And we actually presented this concept of a spore-based probiotic. And when we did, they thought it was interesting, but the company had just got acquired, so they decided not to move forward with it. But we thought it was important enough because lots of people buy probiotics with their hard-earned money, and they're counting on probiotics to do something beneficial for them, when the vast majority of probiotics in the market probably don't do anything. And so it became really important to us as a mission to bring this product to market, lead the way in research and education around the microbiome, and then really at the end of the day, change people's lives. And we focused in on, when we talk about conditions, leaky gut was the original condition that we focused in on, because we said that what the research was clear, that was a major driver of chronic conditions. And if you didn't tackle your leaky gut effectively, it became really hard to make progress in lots of conditions. And so needing to resolve leaky gut became a big driver for us. And we saw the spores as a really important way of resolving leaky gut. So that was really how the product came about. It was born out of need.
How do you think that MegaSpores helps leaky gut specifically?
Yeah, and the good thing is we know, because we've done the research to see what the spores are actually doing. It's actually a multifactorial action on leaky gut. The first one is increasing diversity within the microbiome. So what we tend to see is dysbiotic guts that are dysfunctional tend to have low diversity. And the spores actually have a way of increasing diversity within the microbiome. That is bringing back species that are at such low or non-functional levels that their impact's not really felt by the host, and then competing against overgrown and problematic organisms, right? So they help rebalance the microbiome. They also support the keystone species. Keystone species are these really important anaerobic species that you basically find in the human gut. You really don't find them in many other places outside of the human GI tract. And these species actually are the key organisms that maintain the intestinal barrier structure. These are like Faecalibacter prosnitzi, Akkermansia muciniphila. These important keystone species are really critical in starting to rebuild the dysfunctional gut lining. So we saw through our research that the spores did increase the growth of these keystone species as well. And then another part of it is the spores actually increase the expression of the tight junction proteins. And these are the proteins in between the intestinal epithelial cells that keep them cinched up rather than open up where there's gaps in between them. So those are three of the key ways in which these particular spores improve leaky gut. And what we saw in our first published study was in as little as 30 days, we saw over a 60% reduction in leaky gut and all of the inflammatory responses that occur due to leaky gut.
Wow, that's incredible. Wow. What are some other ailments that you have seen healed by using these probiotics?
What's super exciting about it is that when you can address a foundational issue like leaky gut, and you are bringing about control around chronic inflammation throughout the body, you start to see all kinds of things improve, right? So because of that, we've done a number of subsequent studies to look at conditions like inflammatory bowel conditions, right? Can we support the GI tract in the case of inflammatory bowel conditions? And we saw that, yes, the spores do provide a support for a healthy gut. when we're looking at inflammatory bowel conditions. We just recently completed a couple of studies on acne, on non-cystic acne, and we see a very significant reduction in lesion counts, almost a 70% reduction in lesion counts in non-cystic acne when you use the spores, and that is a leaky gut driven condition. We've done some studies on joint issues, where we see an improvement in joint issues or blood lipids, things like elevated triglycerides. Can we support healthier levels of that? And sure enough, you can when you bring in the spores that modulate leakiness in the gut. We work with a lot of patients with autoimmune conditions and immune dysfunctions and sensitivities, food sensitivities. And in general, what we see is by being able to support kind of this underlying factor of chronic low-grade inflammation, we're able to provide a good foundation to do other therapeutics to improve lots of those conditions, right? So when you don't address leaky gut and you're dealing things with, anxiety or autoimmune conditions or skin conditions, but leaky gut is still there, if you don't address it adequately, you're basically taking one step forward, two steps back, right? Because the leaky gut will continue to drive those conditions because it's the biggest source of chronic inflammation. But when you get that under control, then all the things you do to help those other conditions will become much more effective, right? We also have done a metabolic study because we're looking at how do we improve people's metabolism to make them crave food less, start to lose that visceral fat, improve glucose metabolism. And we were able to do that by using these strains and a prebiotic just by changing the microbiome. We didn't have those individuals change their diet. We didn't have them change any exercise. And in a 90-day period in overweight individuals, we saw almost a 38% reduction in visceral fat mass without doing anything different about their diet or exercise. And it's all from modulating the microbiome and tackling leaky gut.
Wow. I was just going to ask you, how long do you generally see improvement in the gut by taking your probiotics?
Many of our studies are 30 days. Recently, in the last few years, we've gone to a 90-day component to it just to see what happens. Does it trend as improving over time, or does it ebb and flow to a certain degree, right? The gut is complex and complicated, so it's hard to presume. But in most cases, people will start to see a measurable difference in a 30-day period.
Are there any studies that show that nutrients are better absorbed by taking these specific probiotics? I've just been curious about that.
Yeah, so we, let me think if we've done a study that speaks to that. So yes, to a certain degree. We've done some gut modeling studies where we looked at improvements in nutrient absorption. And we looked at utilization of things like protein in the body, right? And we do see an improvement. We also know that in an inflamed gut, that nutrient absorption gets completely compromised. We know this from conditions like celiac disease, right? So these individuals have lots of what you call enteropathy. That's a kind of the flattening of the GI tract, the loss of those microvilli, the lots of inflammation and damaged mucosa. Those individuals don't absorb, for example, fat-soluble vitamins well. So people who have celiac disease tend to have higher incidence rates of osteoporosis and skin damage and brittle nails and brittle teeth and so on, because they don't absorb their vitamin D well, or their K2 well, or A well, right? So we know that a compromised gut is going to compromise your nutrient absorption and utilization, which is important because, the old saying of you are what you eat is really you are what you absorb, right? You can eat all the good stuff you want, but if you don't have a healthy gut to translate that to nutrition, then you get diminishing return on all of those good choices you're making with food. And also keep in mind that more than 50% of the nutrients we need that are critical to our survival, we cannot get from food. It has to be created for us in our gut, right? For example, if you look at polyphenols, and we know that polyphenols are really important compounds as nutrients to us. But there's another nutrient called urolithins, which are critically important to the function of our mitochondria in our cells. It's the powerhouse or the engine of our cells. We cannot get urolithins from our diet. It doesn't exist in the food, in the diet. What has to happen is we have to consume polyphenols, and then we have to have the right bacteria in our gut to convert the polyphenols into urolithins. And then that helps our cells, right? So a huge chunk of the critically important nutrients floating around in your body have to be produced in the gut. They cannot come from food. They don't exist in food. And so that becomes a really important part, because we have this misnomer of an idea that we can gain all our nutrients that we want from our diet, right? I've heard people say things like, you don't really need a supplement or a probiotic, because if you just eat a very healthy diet, you're fine, right? And the answer is that's not true, because only half of the nutrients you need for survival come from the diet. The other half have to be created. And if you don't have the right gut, you don't have the right constitution, the right bacteria, you're not creating those compounds, and you're going to be deficient. It doesn't matter how good of a diet you eat.
Why do you think we don't have the right constitution anymore? As a species?
I think there's a lot of factors, right? Number one, we live in a very toxic world from a chemical perspective, right? So we're exposed to untold amounts of chemistries from just everything that we surround ourselves with, right? All this equipment that we use, of course, and personal care products and fabrics and glues and all of these things. None of those things have really been looked at from the perspective of microbes, right? How do these things impact the microbes that make up the vast majority of your system, right? So one of the things I always say is that a human being is a beautiful microbial construct. We're basically made up of thousands of different species that live together in the shell, which is a human with a human body, and have to work together to propagate the functionality of the whole community. So we are a microbial construct. We have more bacteria in us than we have human cells. We have more bacterial DNA in us than we have human DNA. And we've taken this microbial construct and put it in an antimicrobial world, right? So we've essentially created an anti-human world that we now live in. And so most things around us impact us in some negative way or the other. So the toxicity is one thing. The second thing is lack of exposure to natural environments, right? So we know, and there's lots of studies on showing that cultures or geographies where they live closer to the land, like in rural areas versus urban areas, people in rural areas tend to have higher diversity in the microbiome and tend to be healthier. Cultures that live more within the land versus cultures that are very metropolitan tend to do better, the people that live closer to the land. So we lose exposure to these important microbes in the environment, and that the constant osmosis that we have with environmental microbes. Another big part of it is loss of diversity in our diet. You know, we eat like crap, to be frank, right? So if you look at our ancestors, you know, they ate upwards of 600 different types of foods annually, right? They were called hunters and gatherers, but they gathered and foraged more than they hunted, right? Because hunting was a very taxing event for them. So it's dangerous, right? To go out there and try to hunt something, to kill it and eat it. And so it became kind of a delicacy for certain times, but most of the time they foraged and they gathered, and they found lots of diversity of foods. Humans are omnivores in that way, right? We can eat all kinds of seeds and roots and tubers and nuts and, you know, berries and so on. And so that diversity in diet drove the development of diversity in your microbiome. And ultimately in your gut microbiome, diversity is the most important thing. And so when we start to, you know, wean ourselves off of this vast, diverse, colorful palette of a diet, and then we go towards like 4 different types of foods, right? Everything we eat is either based on corn, based on soy, right? Just like 4 or 5 staples of things. Everything's made out of wheat flour, corn flour, soy flour, and you know, although the food all looks different, the components that make up the food are very similar. So our diversity sucks. And because of that loss in diversity in our diet, we are losing diversity in our microbiome as well. And then there are other egregious things like overuse of antibiotics, of course, not only as a prescription, but also in our food system. If you're feeding animals antibiotics and you're consuming those animals, or those antibiotics are making their way to the water system, those things are all harming the gut microbiome. And then pesticides and herbicides on agricultural products, right? So those are chemistries that act as very powerful antimicrobials that kill good bacteria over time. So there's an endless list of things that compromise our gut microbiome. And we have and do very few things that support the gut microbiome on a regular basis.
That was my next question. Okay, let me ask you, how long do you recommend somebody takes your probiotics to heal?
Yeah. So you can make, as we mentioned before, you can make significant progress in a 30-day period, but we see additional benefits occurring at 60 and 90 days in most conditions that we look at. But really, when you think about a probiotic like MegaSpore, it's really designed around this concept of having an ongoing exposure and relationship with certain types of bacteria. Right? If we were living back in the natural environment, we would be gaining daily exposure to these organisms through living off the land and eating dirt and drinking water out of rivers and streams. And so really what we need is constant exposure. So most people go on a maintenance dose of it for long term, because that's one of the few things that's going to go in and actually protect your gut microbiome from the constant damage that is occurring. Right. So you'll see 30 to 90 days as like a real therapeutic window. And beyond that, you would just use it either daily or every other day as kind of your ongoing protection. It's the same as you drive your car every time and, there's dangers out there. So you put on that seatbelt every time. Right. So it's a bit of a seatbelt for your targeted microbiome, because unfortunately, your microbiome is being targeted by thousands of things out there that you expose yourself to every day.
Yes. And then I had a question. So the instructions say to start slowly. You're going to take one capsule every other day, then you're going to take one capsule daily, then you're going to take two. So right. Question, do you prefer people take one, once they get to week 3, do you prefer that they take one in the morning, one at night with meals? What do you recommend?
We always recommend taking them both together at the same time. And you always want to take them with meals. That's, you're supposed to consume your probiotics with food, right? That's in the natural environment. When we gain exposure to probiotics, we gain it through eating things. And so these bacteria are a true probiotic functions within the food in your system, because in part, they are helping you actually break down the food. Like the spores, for example, produce digestive enzymes to help you break down the carbohydrates and the proteins and the fats that are coming in with the food. On top of that, then they're also utilizing the food to convert and create new compounds like short chain fatty acids and urolithins and all of these other things that we mentioned before. So to us, it's most effective when you eat it with food, but it doesn't matter which meal of the day. It could be your first meal of the day, your last meal of the day. That doesn't seem to matter as much.
And why do you recommend that people start very, very slowly, taking one every other day, then one a day, then finally in week 3?
So when we first got the product, this was now coming up on almost 10 years ago. We have a clinic in the north in Chicago, and so we started putting a lot of our patients. My business partner is a functional medicine practitioner. Started putting a lot of his patients on the product. And what we found is, like, if you take 100 people and you start them on the spores, the 2 caps per day, which is the full regular dose. Somewhere around 10% of them will have like a die-off reaction, like a Herxheimer reaction, which is like you get cramping, loose stool and just kind of discomfort in the GI tract. But it became really hard to know who those people were. Like it wasn't always the very sensitive or frail people. It wasn't always the people that seemed more sickly. So it became hard to predict who it was. So we started just titrating the dose up for everybody to minimize that impact. But typically it impacts around 10% of people. And if you titrate the dose like we suggest, then that becomes a minimal issue, but it's a good sign actually, because and the reason why people get that is because one of the first things that the spores do when they get in your system is they actually identify and compete against problematic organisms like pathogenic organisms. And by doing so, some of these pathogenic organisms will kind of do like a Hail Mary last hurrah, and they'll like kick out a bunch of their toxins, and that can present as, GI discomfort and so on. So it's well known in natural medicine. It's called a Herxheimer reaction, or a healing issue. It's a good thing. It just can be uncomfortable for some people, and so we taper them up to minimize it.
Yes. Okay. Makes sense. So you touched on leaky gut, non-cystic acne. Can you please tell me some of the other things that you have witnessed people heal over the past 10 years using these probiotics?
Yeah. So, we really look at all components of the body, right? So we look at the metabolic system. We've done studies, as I mentioned, on that, on obese individuals or overweight individuals,
Yeah.
And looking at visceral fat mass. So we get lots of responses from people about how it reduces their cravings, how they're losing weight on the product, despite not really actively trying to lose weight. One of the systems that we found that becomes dysfunctional when your gut is leaky is that gut-brain connection, where your gut is telling your brain to stop producing hunger hormone after you've eaten enough food, right? So stop producing ghrelin, which is a hunger hormone, and instead produce leptin, which is a satiety hormone. That issue it's called leptin resistance, becomes a big driver of metabolic dysfunction, and then eventually obesity and even type 2 diabetes. What we've seen in our studies is we can correct that dysfunction, that miscommunication. That was in our first publication. And so that's why we did the metabolic health study. Now we're seeing people going, wow, I don't crave things anymore. I don't have to eat as much. I feel full sooner, right? Because all those signals are working. And we learn to undo those signals over time by abusing them. But once we bring them back into fruition and they're working again, it can be very powerful in getting the people to stop overeating, stop craving certain things, right? Sugars and so on. We also see lots of improvement on skin, and that's why we had the impetus to do the 2 acne studies. Which is acne is a inflammatory metabolic condition, like a lot of other inflammatory conditions on the skin. And in general, where any kind of inflammation in the skin, any condition where there's redness involved in the skin or an immune response to the skin, we can play an important role in supporting the system for those conditions, right? So because obviously the vast majority of your immune tissue is in your gut. The function of your immune system is dictated by your gut microbiome. And so if you can improve your gut microbiome by improving diversity, reducing the leakiness of the gut, you're going to improve your immune function as well. And that can be realized in a number of ways. It can be realized in dampening unfavorable immune responses. These are, areas where you don't want your immune system to respond to, like to food particles and environmental particles in the case of allergies and sensitivities, or to things on your skin in the case of dermatitis, where you're touching things and everything you touch leaves a rash on your skin, all the way to attacking your own body, right? In people with autoimmune conditions. So supporting your immune system becomes a really critical part of helping lots of those conditions. And so lots of our clinicians use this foundationally as a way of supporting the immune system as they're trying to figure out those conditions in their patients, right? And again, this becomes very foundational. And that's really the message we want to put across, is that it's not a magic bullet for any given condition, right? It's really about getting back to basics on gut health. It's about getting your gut to be functional again, right? Getting your microbiome to be working for you, getting your immune system in your gut to be functional again, getting the digestive process to be not only functional, but optimized. When you can do that, then all the other things you do to help with the conditions you're dealing with improve quite a bit. We actually came out with a psychobiotic at the end of last year. Psychobiotic is any kind of probiotic that has a gut-brain function, right? That has an impact on your brain. And this product, and it's called Zen Biome, is really quite powerful. There's about 7 or 8 published studies on it showing a significant reduction in cortisol response when you experience a stressor. So not only physiologically, the stress has less impact on you, your perception of the stress is reduced quite a bit. So it works really well for daily mood balancing and making you feel more calm and less stressed. It also shifts brain waves. So it puts people a little bit more into the theta wave throughout the day, which is that meditative state, right? That's where you're very rational, you can think very critically, and your mind is not clouded by negative thoughts and all that. And that's actually the whole goal of meditation, is to get into that theta wave band, right? And so being able to do that with a probiotic is really effective. And what we've seen, even with that, because this is a separate strain, this is a bifidolongum strain that has very unique features to do all of this. When we use that strain with the MegaSpore, it's even more effective because we are stopping the constant inflammatory damage that creates dysfunction in the gut-brain axis, while we're utilizing a new probiotic that actually improves the gut-brain axis. So MegaSpore pairs really well with other therapeutics or other products that will help other issues as well. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, that's incredible. I wanted to just touch on 2 things.
Yeah.
A lot of us are dealing with food addiction and overeating and not knowing when we are fully satiated because, like you talked about, the leptin resistance, has been broken, kind of those receptors. And so I'm wondering, how do your probiotics help heal? How do those bacteria heal? And what are some other things we can do to start to recognize when we are truly full?
Yeah. So a couple things. There's 2 pathways really that create that issue of almost being addicted to food, with compounding on top of that the inability to feel satiated, right? There's 2 mechanisms at play here. Number one, food is a dopaminergic compound, meaning it's supposed to create a dopamine release. And the reason for that is dopamine kind of triggers the reward centers of your brain, right? It was very good for our species to be motivated to go out there and find food, right? Because keep in mind, food was not easily accessible for the most part. It took a lot of energy, risk, and work to go out there and find food. And every animal, human included, are inherently lazy, right? If given into our vices, we would basically just lay around all the time, right? If you look at just animals, you go to a safari or a zoo, they're sitting around 90% of the time. And I look at my dogs, they're fascinating because they sleep like 22 hours of the day, right? They really don't do a whole lot when they have everything that they need. And so inherently as animals, we're lazy. So our biological system has a way of motivating us to do the things that are good for us. So food is one of those things. Sex, one of the reasons why sex feels good, and because it creates dopamine, because our biology wants us to do that, right? And so because food can stoke dopamine, it triggers this reward center of the brain, and having low dopamine stimulus is one of the bases for addiction, right? So addiction comes from people who have poor dopamine response, or saturated, or their dopamine receptors are saturated, so they don't get the trigger as the same as others. So they keep looking for things that trigger that dopamine response, and it becomes more and more extreme over time. So when you look at the food side of it, the 2 factors are when your gut is leaky, right? And you have endotoxins leaking through. Endotoxins are these toxins that are made by certain class of bacteria in your gut lining. If your gut becomes leaky, those toxins leak through into circulation. When those leak through into circulation, they do 2 things. One is one of the things that I already explained. They create this leptin resistance by disrupting the communication between the gut and the brain, where the gut tells the brain we have enough food, stop producing the hunger hormone, and produce the satiety hormone called leptin, right? You need that leptin to come up for you to feel full and actually almost have an aversion to food, right? Remember, we've all been in that situation before where you're so hungry, you see something that you really crave is delicious, you eat it and you overeat it, and then it becomes almost disgusting to look at it anymore, right? So it's almost that aversion. You go from like nothing looks or sounds better than that food to like, I can't look at it anymore, right? So that is a change in hormone response in your body. That's the ghrelin, the hunger hormone, coming down, and leptin, the satiety hormone, going up. So if your gut is leaky and you have endotoxins leaking through, that's the first thing that goes out of whack, is the leptin and ghrelin balance. And then the second thing that goes out of whack is those endotoxins can actually bind your dopamine receptors and interfere with dopamine binding. So now you're in the situation where it's harder for you to get a dopamine response from food because your dopamine receptors are clogged up and your leptin response is compromised. So it causes you to overeat anyway, right? But your motivation for overeating, not only is it that you can't feel the satiated component to it yet, you also are still trying to stoke dopamine, and it's harder and harder for you to stoke dopamine. So it's a double whammy to driving food addictive type of behavior. And the real only fix to that really is, and we blame people. We say that, they have poor self-control, right? They have no willpower. Why do you not eat that cupcake? Just don't look at it. Or why don't you make better food choices? Like, why do you eat this and this is that? It's become this kind of blaming scenario where we're saying the people that eat poorly are purely because of choice, when in fact, biology has a lot to do with why those behaviors are the way they are, right? And what we were able to show in that metabolic health study is if you start to change their biology through the microbiology, their behaviors change. And the behaviors go towards eating less frequently, and having less cravings and eating less volume in general. And then they start to lose weight, lose the critical fat, and improve insulin response. So that's the key. And I think your question of what can people do, I think a critically important thing for them is to use a probiotic that deals with leaky gut. And then, and then try to get a prebiotic in that increases short chain fatty acid production, because another very important postbiotic, this is a compound that's made by probiotic bacteria in your gut. You can't really get it from food in any effective way, is to get more butyrate out of your system. Butyrate plays a very important role in that leptin ghrelin response, right? So if you get more prebiotics and fibers in, and then you get more probiotics in, like the MegaSpore that deals with leaky gut, you're going to start changing the biology that drives the behavior, right? And it's not the behavior that drives the biology, it's the biology that drives the behavior. And it's interesting that there's been some studies by the American Diabetic Association looking at individuals that are obese and type 2 diabetic. And what's clear is that if you're obese or you have type 2 diabetes, you have very high leaky gut, right? Compared to individuals of the same age who are not obese and don't have type 2 diabetes. Then the question was, are those individuals, do they have really high leaky gut because they made themselves obese and they made themselves type 2 diabetic? Or did they become type 2 diabetic and obese because they originally had really high leaky gut to begin with? And the results are clear, is that it's the leaky gut that started it all, right? So the individuals that became obese and type 2 diabetic had more leaky gut before they were obese and type 2 diabetic than individuals that don't end up with obesity and type 2 diabetes, right? So it's the biology that changes first, and then that dictates the behavior, and then the behavior creates the phenotype or the response, where now you have type 2 diabetes, your obesity, your food cravings, and all of those problems as well.
We speak a lot about leaky gut. Can you just tell us a few symptoms that somebody might be experiencing if they have leaky gut?
Yeah, so one of the things I mentioned is that leaky gut becomes a foundational driver of lots of different conditions, right? Because it's the most prominent source of chronic low-grade inflammation. And when you look at the vast majority of chronic conditions that people deal with, they all are dictated by chronic low-grade inflammation. There was a 2015 publication in the Frontiers of Immunology, which was a meta-analysis publication, meaning it was a paper that looked and studied lots of other papers and came up with conclusions. The conclusions they came up with was that leaky gut, intestinal permeability, was the biggest driver of workplace absence, mortality, and morbidity worldwide, right? It was the biggest driver of death and disability worldwide, leaky gut, right? And this was a study of hundreds and hundreds of other studies. And the reason for that is because when you have that major source of chronic low-grade inflammation, all kinds of systems in your body fall apart. So if you have any sort of food intolerances, right? If the things you can't eat and you just eat it and your system bloats, or you get a rash, or you feel like crap, whatever it may be, you likely have leaky gut. If you have any sort of immune dysfunctions, right? Whether you have a propensity for inflammatory conditions, or you get rashes, or psoriasis, eczema, those kind of things, or your immune system is just kind of weak and you're more susceptible to illnesses than your friends and other people you know. If you have things like acne, rosacea, those are all driven by leaky gut. If you have brain fog, hormone imbalances, or endocrine disruptions, those are all driven by leaky gut. If you get anxiety, if you don't sleep well, right? If you can't go to sleep easy, or you can't stay asleep effectively, those are all components of leaky gut. So the list just goes on. Virtually every chronic condition can be tied back to being driven at least by leaky gut. Leaky gut may not be the initial onset of it, but the condition's being driven by it, right? And what's scary about the leakiness in the gut is that the first study that we did on it in 2017, we screened 100 healthy, what we call healthy normal college students, right? So what does that really mean? Well, by the definition, the scientific definition of healthy normal, when you look at studies, we're looking at individuals that don't have any chronic disease, aren't taking any medication for any chronic disease, of normal body weight, relatively young age, average age around 22, 23. These are people that you'd consider to be in the prime of their lives, right? They're fit, they're healthy, they don't have any conditions, they're not dealing with anything. 55% of them had very severe leaky gut, right? 55%, to the point where it would be clinical in a few years, meaning they will feel symptoms and conditions from it. So when you look at a population, an adult population that has any sort of condition, allergies, asthma, skin conditions, anxiety, whatever it may be, 100% of those people have leaky gut. It's inevitable.
Wow, I definitely did not know that. That's incredible and scary. And luckily, we're talking about it today. And so I wanted to say one more question, just one more. Thank you for your time, by the way. Thank you, Kiran, for your time creating such an amazing product. Like I said at the top of the hour, I take this every single day. I've been taking it since March. And so that's a few months now, and it's really helped me. I healed my bloating. I had major digestive issues, pain. My hair has been growing like crazy. I know it has to be this. I've been doing some other things, but this is the main change that I have done. And so thank you for creating this product. Sure. And by the way, guys, if you'd like to check it out, okay, MegaSpore probiotic, I will leave the link below. And also I would like to say thank you to my friend Matt from myrawintuition.com. He's the one who recommended this. So everybody go follow Matt, Raw Intuition on YouTube. And I'll leave the links below for the website to check it out. See if it might be something that you might find valuable and could help you. It certainly has helped me. And so my last question is, if you could say one thing to everyone in the world, okay, if I could put headphones on, everyone in the world, everywhere, and I translate your voice into every language, what would you like to communicate to everyone out there?
That's a great question. So I would say that one of the most important messages to convey to people right now is a message of hope, right? Because I think in the world today, especially when we're talking about health, people suffer from a lot of lack of hope, because there's, 6 out of 10 American adults are suffering from at least one chronic condition, right? And many of these chronic conditions don't necessarily have an answer in the conventional approaches to medicine that most people are exposed to, which means that you have to live with the idea that you are this condition, and you have to live a abbreviated life or somewhat compromised life because you're dealing with a condition, or you have to live in fear of the onset or progression of a condition, right? If your parents had Alzheimer's, you're going to be living in fear that you might develop Alzheimer's, right? And that there's a lot of fear around health and people's outcomes and so on. But one of the messages that I want to put across to people is that we live in a very exciting time when it comes to biology and understanding the human condition, because we're discovering the microbiome. The microbiome accounts for a huge majority of all of the things that happen in your body every single day. And a dysfunctional microbiome also accounts for the vast majority of conditions that we deal with, which means that most of the conditions that we worry about, we think about, that seem incurable or seem like conditions that, you know, it's just bad luck, you got them and now you have to deal with them, whether it's autoimmune conditions or cancers or heart disease or diabetes, you know, whatever it may be, those conditions have an origin, and those origins are ecological. They stem from a microbiome ecology and a dysfunction in that ecology. And the research is becoming more and more clear that if you fix that ecosystem, you really can fix many of these problems. So there's so much hope out there for all of the chronic conditions that people are suffering from or are afraid that they're gonna develop over time, because we're finally starting to understand the human body and what drives it, what makes it function the way it functions. You know, something as scary as Alzheimer's, I'll bring up again, right? The prevalence of it going up every single year, more and more people suffering from it. It's a very scary condition. In a few years, there's going to be a probiotic cure to Alzheimer's, you know, a condition that seems really very difficult to tackle. So it's an exciting time. And I think one of the second parts of that message is that people really need to be empowered to take on their own health and wellness, right? We can't lean on our systems to do that for us. We can't lean on our governments. We can't lean on our doctors. We can't lean on, you know, establishments to try to do that for us. We have to empower ourselves with information, like, you know, you get from programs like this, with products, with knowledge, and we have to take it on ourselves. Nobody cares more about your ailments than you do, and nobody cares more about your ailments than your loved ones. And so between you and your loved ones, you have to create your own community of empowered people to improve your own health and outcomes, right? So, and there's so much you can do. There's so much within your power to help. And people for a long time would feel very hopeless, right? If the doctor didn't give them a pill, if there wasn't a magic bullet to cure this issue, then it's just something they have to figure out how to live with. That's not the case anymore. There's lots you can do. So, you know, educate yourself, empower yourself, take your health into your own hands in many ways. And there's a lot of hope out there.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining me, for your time. You're amazing. Thank you for the amazing product. And thank you everybody for watching. I'll leave all the links below, and have a beautiful day. Thank you so much, Kiran.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.